for coming out and being here for the Tennessee Valley Historical Society's fall quarterly meeting. We would love to have all of you join us. We have wonderful guests. We have a good time. We try our best to preserve history in every way we can.
Raise money for scholarships.
And the money that we raise through memberships or fundraisers, all of it goes to the scholarships. We have a scholarship endowment at the University of North Alabama. So,
Welcome, everybody. I know that a lot of you know Ed and have been reading and hearing about him for many years. We found a commonality. We both grew up finding crawfish at Cypress Creek. He grew up on that far end of Cypress Mill Road, down close to the creek in the woods. And we both went to Gilbert School when Mr. Richards was there, and I'm sure some of y'all probably did too. He then went on to graduate from Coffee High School and has incidentally been participating in their reunion activities this past week. So it's nice to have our hometown boy back here. He graduated from Coffee, then he graduated from Auburn, and went into the Air Force. And in the interest of time, I'm not even going to try to list all of his accomplishments, medals, awards, that sort of thing. But what we came today to hear from is he's going to share with us his experiences in flying the SR-71 Blackbird, and as I'm sure you know, he made and maintains the world airspeed record. So as I say, we're very proud of our hometown.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Very welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you, Phyllis. Sure is an honor to be with you today. I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak. Now, she mentioned that speed record. The speed record that we did was actually a coast-to-coast speed record for an airplane, official coast-to-coast speed record for an airplane. I'll tell you about that later on in my talk. But it was funny that night. We did that record in 1990, and that night on Johnny Carson came out and said, "Did you all hear about that jet today that flew from coast to coast in just over an hour?" He said, "We're just lucky to have the pilot in our audience tonight." And the camera panned to the back, and in the back there was this guy with real long hair, and it was sticking straight back behind his head. So I got a kick out of that. You know, I had to park 3 blocks away, and all those folks dressed in Renaissance costume looked at me like, "Man, he's dressed up weirdly." Well, I think you'll enjoy hearing about the SR-71 Blackbird. I was extremely fortunate to fly the airplane. It served our country for 25 years, and I got to fly it during its last 6 years of its service. I was just 15 years old when President Johnson announced its existence in 1964. And I thought, man, I'd sure like to fly that plane someday. So it really is a dream come true. And I'll tell you briefly how I got to the airplane. After Coffee High, I went to Auburn and majored in electrical engineering. And during that, it was 5 years because I was a co-op student. So during that 5 years, I was also ROTC and learned to fly through Air Force ROTC. And then at the end of those, after graduation, and I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Force. And then I went to pilot training out in Arizona for a year. Loved flying the T-37, T-38. And then my first assignment then was the RF-4 Phantom, and our mission was flying high-speed, low-altitude photography, and loved that training and mission. So we were trained for combat. I never was in combat, but we trained really hard to be ready in case our country called on us. We did a lot of formation work air refuelings and low altitude reconnaissance. Then after 5 years in the RF-4, I was able to switch over to the F-4 fighter aircraft and was 3 years as a fighter pilot and learned that all the tactics and delivering accurately weapons delivery, and I especially enjoyed learning the tactics of air-to-air combat. Again, I never was in combat, but we trained really hard to be ready at a moment's notice if we were called upon. Then after a total of 9 years in the F-4 Phantom, the SR-71 folks invited me out through my application for the interview. It was a week-long interview, and it was more than just a sit-down interviews. They included a thorough flight physical. They put me in the simulator to see how I was going to take training, instruction, and also flew me twice in the T-38. And amazingly, they chose me to join the unit. So, and then there was just a dream come true. Love flying the SR-71. At the time, it was not classified that it existed, but most things about the airplane were classified. So it's all been declassified now, and I can tell you all about it. It was built in the early 1960s and still looks futuristic to me. It was built to be the world's fastest, highest airplane so that it would not be shot down. We did reconnaissance in dangerous areas of the world, keeping a close watch on the countries that might start hostilities. Our top altitude was 85,000 feet. We normally operated between 75,000 and 80,000 feet, so we would, as we got lighter, we would gradually climb higher, so we'd be more efficient as we got lighter, and we'd be more efficient gas-wise to go higher as we got lighter. So our top speed was Mach 3.3. So you might wonder, just how fast is Mach 3.3? The speed of sound near sea level is about 760 miles an hour, but up high where it's cold, the air molecules are bouncing around slower, so the speed of sound is close to 660 miles an hour up there. And so multiply that times 3.3. Now, just how fast is that? In 1955, I enjoyed with my next door neighbor playing Superman in 1955, and they used to advertise Superman as being faster than a speeding bullet. Well, the SR-71 is faster than a speeding bullet. So we would cruise faster than muzzle velocity of a 30-06. Exciting airplane to fly. Now this is an artist's depiction of the shock wave behind a supersonic airplane. You know, a boat leaves a wake in the water. A supersonic airplane leaves a three-dimensional wake, that shock wave. And so everybody that's underneath that shock wave as we fly by, all of a sudden they'll hear boom, you know, and sometimes it'll be a double boom, a shock wave off the nose and a shock wave off the wing. Now the SR-71 is a two-seat Blackbird. The earliest version Blackbirds were operated about a year before the SR-71 started operating, and those early CIA Blackbirds were single seat, and they did not have a window behind the cockpit because they didn't have two people. And the Blackbird over at Huntsville in front of the Rocket Center is you'll notice it's a A-12 single seat Blackbird, and Alabama's got more Blackbirds than any other state except California, but all three of ours are A-12 single seat Blackbirds. One at Rocket Center, one in the Air Museum at just outside the Air Museum at Birmingham, and then one in the airplane hangar close to the USS Alabama in Mobile. Now, Bob Gilliland is the first test pilot to fly the SR-71. He first flew it in December the 22nd, 1964, and I just never imagined back in 1964 that he would become one of my best friends. He's 22 years older, but we became really best of friends. He passed away in 2019. He was inducted into the to the National Aviation Hall of Fame, and here I am with his son and his biographer. His biographer is on the left, Keith Dunovit, from Athens, by the way. And they created a book, biography of Bob, and I was fortunate to be asked to be the technical advisor for the book, and I take a lot of pride in my contribution to the book, and I'm happy with the accuracy of the book. Now, the SR-71 was built by the Skunk Works section of Lockheed, and Kelly Johnson is the designer of the airplane. He was born in 1910, and he's sometimes called the Leonardo da Vinci of airplane design. He was probably our premier airplane designer. I read his biography also, and really an interesting biography. He didn't want to be a pilot, he wanted to design airplanes. So this particular picture was made because he got a flight in one of the jets that he designed. And when he was 12 years old, he put together a scrapbook, aviation scrapbook, and his stepson, John Horrigan, invited me to his home in Los Angeles some years ago, showed me Kelly Johnson's 12-year-old scrapbook, and showed that he had blown up Kelly's 12-year-old designs and hung them in his hallway in his house. These are some of his designs back in 1922. This is even before Charles Lindbergh made his flight. So these these pictures were state-of-the-art, would have been state-of-the-art back in those days. I got a special kick out of this newspaper article in his scrapbook. It tells that the French have just taken the speed record from the Americans at 278 miles an hour for an airplane. And you see at the top, notice with those exclamation points, you can practically imagine young Kelly saying, that is just unacceptable, and I'm going to design an airplane that'll take the speed record someday. And he did. So Kelly Johnson was not only a brilliant engineer, but also a brilliant manager, and that combination of engineering and management is what made him so very successful. So he had a whole team that helped him with the Blackbird. Show you some of his designs, the P-38 in World War II, F-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, the F-104, the U-2 spy plane, and you remember, some of you would remember, and I do, as 11 years old, Francis Gare Powers was shot down over Russia in 1960 and held prisoner for 2 years. So Kelly Johnson decided he would build an airplane too high and too fast to be shot down. His crowning achievement, the beautiful and at the time mysterious SR-71 Blackbird. The main challenge in designing a Mach 3 plane was heat on the airplane. So even though we're near 80,000 feet with temperature minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, friction with the air caused the skin temperature to average 550 degrees. So there were places that were hotter than that. Well, normal aluminum alloys get too soft at that high temperature, so he had to design and pioneer manufacturing with titanium. So most of that airplane is made of titanium that could take that high temperature. And all the engineering work was done with slide rules back in the early 1960s. As a matter of fact, my engineering class of 1972 was among the last to be using only slide rules. And I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s that engineering students started having the opportunity to use little hand calculators, which are so much better. The airplane is also famous for leaking fuel, and one reason is that the airplane, because of the heat, would expand in length about 4 inches during the flight because of that high temperature, and then when it would land, it would contract. And they had sealant that would try to prevent the fuel from leaking, but that sealant would get hot and brittle over time, and it would leak more and more and more until finally they would put it back into maintenance and reseal those joints. But every time we'd go out to fly, there was always a big puddle of fuel underneath the airplane. And they told me it was not dangerous, that it was a special fuel, JP7 fuel, that had a real high flash point. They said you can throw a match in it, just put the match out. I never did actually try that, but that's what they told me. So it has two big Pratt & Whitney J58 engines, 34,000 pounds of thrust apiece. Jet engines are interesting and complicated, and our maintenance troops did a great job maintaining them, keeping them in good working order. Now, in the middle of the jet, you can see those. In the middle, you see those black tubes. There's 6 of those black tubes around the jet, and so when you're above Mach 2, valves start opening and will vent high pressure air from the 8th stage of the compressor around the combustion chamber and directly into the afterburner. So it gave the engine a ramjet effect. Here's a jet engine on the test cell, and you see the bright spots in the exhaust caused by supersonic airflow in the exhaust, and we call those bright spots shock diamonds. Here you can see the shock diamonds in flight. Now, in front of each engine is a cone called a spike, and that spike is part of the inlet system, and the spike would withdraw into the inlet as much as 26 inches in flight. So the faster we went, the more that spike would withdraw into the inlet and position the shock wave in just the right position in the throat. So the air coming in would go through that shock wave, and then on the right side of that shock wave, the air is being compressed just due to the high speed of the airplane. The high speed of the airplane is compressing that air, and on the right side of the shock wave, the air is subsonic. You have to have air subsonic to go through a jet engine. So the molecules are closer together, and they're slower, and they're closer together, and the pressure is about 14.7 psi, which is about sea level. So the jet engine thought it was at near sea level the whole time because the air was compressed like sea level pressure. Now, another unique feature was we'd be flying along, and sometimes that shock wave would get spit out, and when that happened, all of a sudden you'd lose 80% of the thrust on that engine, and you get a sudden yaw on the airplane, and it happened so suddenly it felt just like a small explosion. So you'd be flying along, and all of a sudden, boom, and it would yaw, and sometimes it bounce your helmet on the glass. But it was not dangerous at all. It would just always startled you, but you knew what it was, and you knew that the computers would send both spikes full forward, open the bypass doors, reset the spikes in the doors, and you'd be off and running again in about 15 seconds. And then if you had repeated unstarts, we had controls in the cockpit. We could set the spikes in the doors manually, depending on the speed that we were at. And we would practice manual inlet from time to time, just so we'd be ready in case we had to. And sometimes we would have to actually fly a manual inlet because the computer wasn't scheduling it properly. Now, when I started, in the early days, they would have maybe several unstarts of flight, and then when I started flying it in 1983, probably had about one unstart every other flight. And by the time the airplane was retired in 1990, we had refined the computer's program so well that we're getting about one unstart every year. So when it was retired, it was flying better than ever it had flown before. So our mission was reconnaissance, taking pictures in high threat areas of the world, keeping a close watch on countries that might start hostilities. So we all took a lot of pride in our mission. We had several cameras on board. Our main camera was in the nose, and then when I started flying in 1983, they started using more and more a sensor called ASARS, synthetic aperture radar. And with this radar, we could get pictures through the night and through the weather, with high resolution, not quite as good as an optical photograph, but it gave you more capability because we got good resolution even at night and in the weather. And so that became our primary sensor in the nose, and we had several different noses with different sensors, so they would bolt the nose on depending on what they wanted to see that day. And we were based at Beale Air Force Base, north of Sacramento, California. And then we would be sent temporary duty to Mildenhall, England, and also Okinawa, Japan. So from those three places, we would fly our worldwide reconnaissance missions. And so we were temporary duty for 6 weeks at a time, and then we'd come back to Beale for a couple of months and practice in the simulator and also the T-38. We always flew the Blackbird with the pressure suit because we were near 80,000 feet. The airplane was most efficient at Mach 3.2 near 80,000 feet. And our cockpit was pressurized to an equivalent of 25,000 feet. But if you lose cockpit pressure and if you're above 63,000 feet, you don't have enough pressure on your body and your blood starts to boil. It always ruins your whole day whenever your blood starts boiling. So we wore a pressure suit as a safety backup to losing cockpit pressure. And the suit was pretty comfortable, really. It had air conditioning tubes through it, and you could adjust the temperature of the air going through. Now, since our cockpit was at 25,000 feet, we had to breathe pure oxygen the whole time, so those are the leads for the pure oxygen that we're breathing during the flight. Just below the visor is a little valve that we could keep ourselves hydrated during the flight. We had a bottle of Gatorade in a plastic bottle, and we just hold that bottle up above and stick that long tube in that valve and take some Gatorade and keep ourselves hydrated during the flight. This is Kurt Osterheld, who I was crewed with for a couple of years. Great guy. He was from Wisconsin. And by the way, he had a cousin, Kay Davis, who taught school with my sister, Donna Underwood. So it's a small world sometimes. Kurt was the RSO, Reconnaissance Systems Officer. Did a great job. You see the bulges at the chest area. That is a life preserver. In case we had to bail out and landed in the water, that life preserver would automatically inflate and keep us afloat. And we also, in our survival kit, we had a small one-man life raft that we could also climb into. So for a typical mission, we would be driven out to the airplane in this van, and we might fly any time of day or night. So this particular morning, I saw the sun coming up, and I said, well, quick, let's get a picture. So it was just a coincidence that we got that picture. And then the sun is shining into the hangar, and these two pressure suit experts are helping us get all hooked up to the airplane because we were wearing thick gloves, hard to make all the connections. So they're hooking us up to the seat belt, our parachute, survival kit, communications lines for our speaker and microphone, air for our pressure suit, oxygen leads for breathing. This is a picture of the cockpit, 1960s cockpit. Now, the airplane was updated through the years with advanced computers and software and sensors, cameras, but they never had a need to update the pilot presentation, and those 1960s presentations worked just fine. This was taken in this simulator with the seat taken out. Now, so we would start engines in the hangar and do our pre-flight checks in the hangar, and then we would taxi out to the runway. And it was always really exciting taxiing out because you knew pretty soon this amazing machine was going to take you right up to the edge of space and 3 times faster than sound. So you knew something pretty special was about to happen. So it was always exciting taxiing out. We'd taxi onto the runway, light the afterburners, always a kick in the pants when the afterburners would light, accelerate rapidly down the runway, lift the nose at 210 miles an hour, 180 knots. We always use knots in the airplane. And we would lift off at 210 knots, 240 miles an hour. And then we would climb out at 450 miles an hour. And it would take 2 minutes from brake release to 25,000 feet, where we would level off at 25,000 feet and join with a tanker in air refuel. Now, it seems funny, the first thing we do is air refuel, but the reason is we always took off with only half a load of fuel. for safety reasons. If we were fully loaded and lost an engine right at liftoff, we might not be able to control the airplane. So for safety, we took off half loaded of fuel, climbed to 25,000, joined with the tanker, and air refueled, got a full load of fuel. And we held 80,000 pounds of fuel. Our gauge was in pounds of fuel, which is about 12,000 gallons of fuel. And this is taken from the boomer spot in the tanker. Now, just forward of the refueling receptacle is you see a round window, and underneath that round window is a little telescope, and that little telescope would automatically slew around and find stars and would update our inertia navigation system. So I thought that was really amazing technology in the early 1960s. And so for that to work properly, you had to dial into the airplane what day of the year you're flying, and they plug in a clock accurate to thousandths of a second, so it knew where the Earth was in its revolution and also where the Earth was in its rotation. Pretty neat, I thought. So after getting full load, we'd back away from the tanker, light the burners, accelerate out ahead and climb. It took about 20 minutes to get to our initial cruise altitude, typically around 75,000 feet. We had this picture was made at about 75,000 feet. And you see a slight curvature on the Earth, but more noticeable than the curvature is how dark it was overhead. So we were above 97% of the air molecule, so it was always really dark overhead. You'd look up and just almost totally black, maybe just really, really dark blue overhead. And so you had the feeling of cruising at the edge of space, even though we were a long way. We're only about 15 or 16 miles high, so we were a long way from any orbit. But it was always real smooth up there because we were above the jet stream, no wind up there, real smooth always. Now, we had a lot of missions along the northern border of Russia, keeping a close watch on those submarine bases along the northern border of Russia and keeping an eye on what they're loading on. They're loading nuclear warheads onto those submarines programmed for destinations right here in the United States. So the SR-71 was one of only a number of ways to keep up with where those submarines, Soviet submarines are. And you know, the shortest distance from Russia to the United States is over the Arctic region. Now here we are cruising along in the springtime, and you see the Arctic ice is starting to break up. It was always interesting to fly along the Arctic Circle, especially in December when the day-night line runs almost east and west, and our flight plan might cross the day-night line a number of times during the flight, and we weren't concerned with where daylight was because we're using ASARs, taking pictures with the radar. So I had one mission that just coincidentally crossed the day-night line 6 times in less than an hour, and so in less than that's the planet Venus there, and so in less than an hour's time, I'd seen 3 sunsets and 3 sunrises. Now here we are descending through about 40,000 feet, and that's where we would typically start leaving a contrail again. So we're descending, going back to our base, and here we are passing by Mount Lassen, which was a volcano that blew in the early 1900s, just north of Beale Air Force Base. We put the landing gear down for landing, fly final approach at 175 knots or 200 miles an hour, and flare the airplane. It was pretty easy to land, really. It landed similar to like a big T-38. It was much easier to land than the U-2 spy plane, which still is operating today because it's a lot cheaper to fly than the SR-71. Then we would touch down and deploy that big orange drag chute, get us slowed down in a big hurry. We'd taxi into the hangar, raise the canopies, and it was always a great feeling of satisfaction after every Blackbird mission. A great feeling of satisfaction. We just flown the world's fastest, highest flying airplane, but best of all, we felt like we had just done something really important for our country and for the cause of freedom. So it was really a very satisfying mission. We felt like we were doing something important for our country. After I had flown the Blackbird for 3 years, let's see, no, it was 2 years. After flying it 2 years, I was upgraded to instructor, and this is our one trainer Blackbird with the back cockpit built up higher so the instructor in the back could see up front, and the instructor in the back also had flight controls. So it was always a great honor to train somebody new in the Blackbird, and when I say new, the pilot new in the Blackbird already had about 10 years of high performance jet experience like I did in the F4. So that's our trainer. Here I had just instructed Jim Halsell on his first Mach 3 flight. The other guys come out and congratulate him, and the wing commander pins on his Mach 3 pin. That's Jim Halsell. I'm really proud of Jim. He was picked up as an astronaut and flew 5 times. He had 5 space shuttle missions, and was really good to invite me down for all 5 of his launches, and it's really exciting watching it in person launch, that space shuttle, especially when you know you have a friend sitting on the end of it. Proud of Jim. Now on our green flight suits, we were wearing these patches, and you see the word Habu there. Habu is another nickname for the Blackbird, and that nickname was given to us by the Okinawans. We flew a lot out of Okinawa, and they thought that our long, black, sleek airplane with its flattened nose reminded them of their highly poisonous snake, the Habu. So they started calling it the Habu, and that name caught on, and it's known about as well as the Habu as it is the Blackbird. Then after a total of 4 years flying out of Beale Air Force Base, I flew 93 overseas reconnaissance missions. One of the 2 test pilot positions came open down at Palmdale, and I'd always wanted to be a test pilot, so I applied and was very fortunate to be picked up, I think primarily because of my engineering degree, and also I had a good record in the Blackbird, so I was really fortunate to be picked as one of the 2 test pilots. And we had 2 test RSOs at Palmdale, and in the middle is Ben Rich, who took over Kelly Johnson's job as director of the Skunk Works after Kelly Johnson retired. Now, Palmdale is close to Edwards Air Force Base, which you see right here, and Edwards Air Force Base is on the edge of Rogers Dry Lake, a 10-mile long hard surface dry lake that you can land an airplane on. So that's the reason Edwards has been a premier test base since the 1940s. If you lost an engine, you could glide it down and land on that 10-mile long hard surface dry lake, Rogers Dry Lake. In the 80s, they put black lines on that dry lake for the space shuttle to line up on and land. So the early space shuttle landings were on Rogers Dry Lake, and then eventually they started landing on Edwards, the concrete at Edwards Air Force Base, and then finally landing at Cape Kennedy. So sometimes we'd go out to Edwards and watch the space shuttle land, and then a few days later taxi out on the back of that big 747 on its way back to Cape Kennedy. That was always a marvelous sight. Then sadly in late 1989, Congress voted to retire the airplane, even though they had spent millions of dollars for new features and that we were testing, new features for the airplane, new sensors, materials, computers, and software. I really enjoyed that flight test work, but they decided to save money and retire the plane because of advances in spy satellites and also unmanned reconnaissance airplanes. So our commander for our last test flight mission invited families of Air Force and also Lockheed to come up and watch our last flight test mission. And then afterwards, after we landed, then signing a lot of autographs. And I'm showing this one because signing an autograph for Sean Genzel, who is Kelly Johnson's step-grandson. And you can see little airplanes all over his shirt. But Sean is now in his early 40s and working for the Skunk Works at Palmdale. Then the Smithsonian said we would like to have an airplane for display, so the decision was made to send the Smithsonian our flight test airplane, tail number 972, and the Smithsonian wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Air Force, Donald Rice, and said, when your pilot brings the airplane to the Smithsonian, please have him set a official coast-to-coast airplane speed record, and that will call the public's attention to what a great airplane it has been for our country for 25 years. So JT and I were very, very fortunate to be assigned to deliver the airplane to the Smithsonian and set that speed record. So I was actually ordered to set a speed record. Anyway, so I feel very fortunate for that opportunity for sure. And that's JT Vita, RSO. And my commander, Don Emmons, said, well, Ed, you can tell them that you flew from coast to coast and sea to shining sea. Tell them you flew from sea to shining sea in just over an hour. And you know that sea to shining sea is a famous line in America the Beautiful. Catherine Bates' wonderful song, America the Beautiful, and got me thinking about America the Beautiful. So our plan was take off from Palmdale. We'd fly up to San Francisco and then out over the Pacific and air refuel going south, and then we would turn toward the east and get a 200-mile running start. And the NAA, the National Aeronautic Association, who verifies official records, would be watching us on radar and would start the clock as we crossed the west coast. And then they had somebody else on the east coast. And then they had several in between, and they wanted city-to-city records also. We did 3 city-to-city records. And you would think a city-to-city record would be from takeoff to landing, but that's not how they do them. As you pass by at speed, they get the time, and when you pass by the destination city, they get the time. So that's why we were able to do a coast-to-coast record as well as 3 city-to-city records. So we would cross the east coast and then make a descending left-hand turn back to Dulles Airport and land. Now, fuel was really, really tight for that flight, so we did not have enough fuel to plan. We did not have enough fuel to cross the west coast at top speed. So we had to plan to cross the west coast at Mach 2.5, accelerate to top speed of Mach 3.3. Normally we weren't allowed to fly faster than 3.2, but my commander gave me permission to fly the top speed Mach 3.3, which we did a few minutes later after we crossed the west coast. And so on March the 6th, 1990, JT and I briefed up our last Blackbird flight, March 6, 1990. It was the wee hours of the morning, and maintenance was getting our airplane ready to fly as we briefed and got ready for the flight. JT and I put on our pressure suits one last time, made sure my pressure suit was going to hold the pressure properly, and make sure my speaker and microphone are working properly. Then we taxied out at 4:15 in the morning, California time, Pacific time, which was 7:15 in Washington, where we're going to take the plane. So we took off at 4:30 in the morning and headed up towards San Francisco. And we flew out over the Pacific, 200 miles out over the Pacific. It was pitch dark out there, and we joined with the tankers and got a full load of fuel. It was pitch dark, but we had refilled at night many times, so we knew how to do that. And then we got a full tank and lit the afterburners. Now this picture was not made that night because it was still pitch dark when we left the tankers, but that might give you an idea of what it looked like as we accelerated away from the tankers. This is what it did look like as we were climbing through about 62,000 feet over the west coast. We're flying supersonic toward the sun, so the sun's coming up rapidly. Then a few minutes later, the sun is up, and we're going right by Lake Mead, formed by Hoover Dam, and at the top you can see the entire city of Las Vegas, going right by the Grand Canyon, going right by the mountain majesties, as Catherine Bates calls it in her song. We passed 60 miles south of Pikes Peak, where Catherine Bates was inspired to write America the Beautiful from the top of Pikes Peak back in the late 1800s. Then we're over that fruited plain that she sang about. Hundreds of miles of prime American farmland. I thought about all those thousands of farmers down there below, starting their day, getting ready to raise food that feeds most of the citizens in our country, and also it's enough food to export overseas. I thought about our brave pioneers that I read about as a boy, taking months to cross country that JT and I were crossing in just a matter of minutes. Thought about what a great country we have, made great by the hard work and sacrifices and prayers, courage of our forefathers. This was a special flight, so I was having all these special thoughts. Now, our eastern part of the country was undercast, so I could not see many features in the eastern part, but JT and I just made sure we enjoyed our one last view of God's earth from 80,000 feet, slight curvature of the earth, darkness overhead, the bright band of blue on the horizon. Made sure we enjoyed the last few minutes of flying this marvelous airplane and thinking how very fortunate we were to serve alongside hundreds of other highly dedicated men and women who served the Blackbird through its 25 years of service. Then when we crossed the East Coast, we had flown sea to shining sea in 67 minutes, 54 seconds. No airplane ever has flown sea to shining sea faster than the Blackbird did that day. Now, the NAA gave the news media an initial estimate of something over 68 minutes, and you see that time advertised sometimes in articles, but that was the NAA went back and reviewed the tapes and decided 67 minutes and 54 seconds is the correct time, and that's the time that's in the record book. So I told you that fuel was really tight, so I had planned it so that we would get back to Dulles with right at minimum required fuel. But they wanted me to make a couple of passes for the crowd there, so they had a tanker for me, and they gave me just a little more fuel so I could make a couple of passes for the crowd there at Washington. Took a little fuel, and then we descended down through the undercast. So they only wanted two passes for the crowd, one at 800 feet, which you see here, and then I circled around for the low pass at 200 feet for the crowd, and that's the picture that they took at 200 feet. So I lit the afterburner so the crowd could feel the power of those two big J-58 engines and see the beauty of those bright orange plumes behind the airplane. And that's the same picture that they printed on the front page of the Washington Post the next morning, March the 7th, 1990. And they had a really nice article about the Blackbird and its service for our country for 25 years. We circled around and landed, deployed that big orange drag chute one last time. Taxied into the Dulles terminal. And Dulles, as you know, is just west of Washington, D.C. Somebody had hung a big American flag on the Dulles Tower, which I really appreciated that patriotic gesture. And the wind has got the flag inverted here. We taxied in. Our maintenance troops were there from Palmdale to receive us. And JT and I climbed out, and I'll never forget the combination of feelings as we climbed out and shook hands. We were happy that we just set some speed records, but mostly feeling sad because that would be our last flight in the Blackbird, last flight ever in the Blackbird, and the last time that beautiful Blackbird would ever fly. So mostly feeling sad about it. Climbed down, and Ben Rich was there to give us a big thumbs up signal. He was from the Skunk Works. They had a short plane side ceremony as the Air Force passed the airplane over to the Smithsonian. Dr. Harwood, who wrote that letter I showed you earlier, talking about how glad he is to receive the Blackbird. Ben Ridge talked about what a great job the Blackbird had done for our country for 25 years. Senator Warner in the brown hat came out because we had landed in his state of Virginia. They presented JT and me with our coast-to-coast airplane speed record certificates, which we really appreciated, but we both knew that it's really the Blackbird's record. We were just lucky to be the crew that day, and any of the crews had the skill and knowledge that could have flown that mission. So we just felt extra lucky, and also knew that it's the Blackbird's record. And I was really surprised to see Mom and Dad on the tarmac. I knew they'd be up there. I knew they'd be up in the crowd near the tower, but somehow they found out who they were and they brought them down to the tarmac. I'm really proud of Mom and Dad. They both were born and raised here in Florence. As a matter of fact, Mother was born less than a block away on Wood Avenue. My dad was born on Tom Bigby Street, just off of Pine Street, nearby here, and they both graduated from Coffee High School. Dad served 3 years in World War II in the Pacific, and then had a 35-year career with TVA here locally. And Mother, while he was in the war, was earning her nursing degree, and then they got married right after he got out of the service in 1946, and she was a nurse in her younger days and was a school teacher later on in her middle age. She went back to school and got her teaching certificate, became a librarian, school librarian at Underwood School, and also taught at Central Elementary. I'm really proud of Mom and Dad. I'm oldest of 5 that they raised, but when my aunt and uncle were killed in a car wreck back in 1969, Mom and Dad took in 4 of their kids too. So Mom and Dad are my main heroes in life. We sure miss them. But besides wonderful parents, I had some outstanding public school teachers, Gilbert, Appleby, and Coffee High. We had a very active church youth group at Northwood Methodist Church. Had an outstanding Boy Scout troop, Troop 287, some outstanding Scoutmaster, primarily Ted Margolin, great experience as a Boy Scout. So I'm really pleased and proud and fortunate to have grown up here in the Shoals area. Okay, next we answered questions from the news media about flying the Blackbird. And on TVs that night, there were short news clips about the Blackbird, and I'll see if this one will play for you.
Pentagon budget cutting, but the SR-71 reconnaissance plane is not going quietly. It was a sonic boom you heard in the San Fernando Valley this morning as John Marshall reports.
The story begins here. Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects, better known as the Skunk Works. In the early 60s, Kelly Johnson and a team of engineers set out to build a plane that would fly faster than a speeding bullet. And that it has, for 25 years. The story ended early this morning at Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale. Lieutenant Colonels Raymond Yielding and J.D. Vita put on their spacesuits for one last historic flight. Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, coast to coast, Los Angeles to Washington. The SR-71, the Blackbird, can cruise at 2,200 miles an hour, 16 miles above the Earth, because its titanium skin can withstand operating temperatures of more than 800 degrees. Flying faster and higher than anything else, the spy plane has never been shot down. After takeoff, the Blackbird was refueled by an Air Force tanker plane, then pointed east, as the 2 J-58 engines were cranked up to maximum cruising thrust. The sonic boom rocked the Los Angeles area just after 6 a.m. The SR-71 did everything it was supposed to do, arriving at Washington's Dulles International Airport 1 hour, 8 minutes, and 32 seconds later, shattering the old record. Average speed, 2,112 miles an hour.
But like every good thing, it must come to an end. So let me say and conclude by saying goodbye to this magnificent, sophisticated flying machine. Bye-bye, Blackbird.
John Marshall, Channel 4 News.
Well, video always brings back a good memory. But so the next day, our maintenance troops prepared the airplane for handover to the museum, and then JT and I had seats in the middle of this big United 767 between the two aisles of that big airplane, and the airplane was a nonstop flight from Dulles Airport, nonstop all the way back to Los Angeles, near our base, and it was a good flight and all, and the service was nice, but gosh, it took 5 hours to get back to California. So this picture, it represents the retirement of the Blackbird. It's now on display at the Udvar-Hazy Center near Dulles Airport, the Smithsonian's big museum out there. It's displayed right in the center of the museum, and in the back there you can see the space shuttle Discovery, and the museum is just full of really interesting airplanes. You can spend hours, actually days in there. Just a really interesting museum. Just out of curiosity, how many of you here have been to the Udvar-Hazy Center? There's about 4 of you. Great. The rest of you would enjoy it if you ever get a chance to go up there. Anyway, we're hoping that the Blackbird will serve as an inspiration for Americans for many, many years in the future, as an example of what hard work and ingenuity could accomplish back in the 1960s. My next assignment was I'm not going to tell you all about it, but I got to fly this little passenger plane out of Andrews Air Base near Washington, so we flew VIPs to wherever their duty required all over the world, and that was really an interesting 5-year assignment also. But during that time period, my RSO JT Vita sadly passed away with cancer at age 50. We sure miss him. He was a good friend, excellent RSO. He had more time in the Blackbird than any other crew member in history. He had 1,392.7 hours in the Blackbird. I had 785 hours, but we sure miss JT. And then about 1.5 years after he passed away, my dad passed away. And so I decided to retire from the service and go to work for Northwest Airlines because I could be based in Memphis and get home to Florence a lot more frequently, give my mom a hand with things. And I enjoyed being an airline pilot also. I enjoyed the other Northwest pilots, and I was always impressed with the quality of the other pilots at Northwest, and enjoyed flying the public where they needed to fly and fly them safely. Then after I'd been with Northwest for 12 years, almost 12 years, I finally had enough seniority to hold the most junior first officer position in the big 747. I wanted to fly that before I retired, so I could easily drive to Memphis, thumb a ride up to Detroit, spend the night in the motel there, and then fly my week-long trip in the 747. Amazing airplane too, held 403 passengers and all their baggage, non-stop from Detroit to Japan on a regular basis. And 77 yards long, had 4 huge Pratt & Whitney engines, 56,000 pounds of thrust apiece. See how big those engines are. And it had a more modern cockpit, and I enjoyed flying with the other pilots, as I said. And here, this is Stu Popwell, who also from Alabama. And then while I was flying the 747, Delta acquired Northwest, painted our 747's Delta colors, so I got to fly it in both Northwest colors and Delta colors. Here I am standing beside the big wheels of that 747. That 747 has 18 wheels, so I guess you could say I retired on an 18-wheeler. And then in 2013, Florence got this F4 for display in Veterans Park. We have a really nice Veterans Park here in Florence, and on display there, this F4 Phantom. I didn't fly this actual airplane, but I flew Phantoms like it. And Mayor Haddock asked me to come out and be part of the ribbon cutting ceremony, and so they insisted on putting my name on the cockpit, but I tried to talk them out of it, and because we've had others from Florence fly the Phantom, but they said, no, you don't have any choice, your name's going on there. And but you do have a choice of the name for the backseater, so I thought about all the great backseaters I flew with in the Phantom, and I finally decided on Ralph Golson, who was a very enthusiastic weapons systems officer in the backseat of the Phantom, and he lost his life in war game exercise with another pilot. We had war game exercises out in Nevada, and they had a crash practicing for the defense of our country, so I felt that he was a good one to put on the name on the back cockpit. So I called one of my buddies to make sure I had the name spelled correctly, and they said, yeah, you got the name right, but on top of that, we want to come. And so they started passing the word, and Florence asked me to give the Veterans Day talk that year. But then a bunch of my Phantom buddies came from out of state for that event, Veterans Day of 2013. I was really touched by the turnout, and some of them decided, well, we ought to line up in the same order that we had a picture taken back in 1979. So we lined up in the same order that we had a special picture made in 1979, and this is it right here. So I'm really proud of all these guys. Two of them had passed away, and especially proud of the tall lieutenant on the far left side, Kevin Chilton, my good friend Kevin Chilton. He became an astronaut, and he's the only astronaut who has ever been promoted to 4-star general. So he was right here in Florence, Alabama for that event. And so this is the picture that we were imitating. I don't know if you see any difference at all. The
dog's not in it, that's
Okay. So this is about my last slide. That same day I wanted my picture taken with my good friend Carl Poole. Carl was on Pearl Harbor when it was attacked, December the 7th, 1941. And I asked Carl a lot of questions about that day, and told me all about that day and about his service for our country during the World War II. This is USS Arizona, but he was on the USS Curtis, which also took some bombs through the deck and was heavily damaged, but they got it operating again for the war. So at one point I said, Carl, we sure owe our freedom to guys like you. And he just paused and said, well, it takes us all. And I think that is so important to remember, that every military man who has served, his job was important for our country in some way. So every military person can take pride in his service. And I think of it beyond the military too. I feel like every job that does something useful for our citizens helps make our country a great place to live. And it takes us all to help make our community and our state and our country a great place to live. And I sure appreciate all of you, all in your careers and your volunteer work. And so thank you all for your service for our country too. That's my last slide. Okay. Thank you.